Welcome to the Fear and Greed Business Interview. I'm Sean Aylmer. Donald Trump's tariffs announcement yesterday has rocked global markets. Australia is certainly at the lighter end, with a 10% impost on our exports to the US, compared to the tariffs imposed on countries like China and Vietnam, Cambodia. Still, it's a big hit from one of our closest allies, and certain companies and sectors within Australia will be feeling it more than others. Bran Black is the Chief Executive of the Business Council of Australia, which represents many of Australia's biggest companies. Bran, welcome back to Fear and Greed.
Thanks so much for having me. It's good to be here.
So what was your initial reaction?
Disappointment. Disappointment, I think, is really the reaction that most Australians would have to the imposition of tariffs on us by our closest, strongest and most historically long-standing ally. It is a disappointing day for Australia. There's no two ways around that. But I think we also need to temper that sense of disappointment with a strong focus on what is ultimately in Australia's interests. There'll be, of course, the gut instinct, if you will, that says, well, if they're going to do this to us, we should do something to them. But the reality is that 1 in 4 jobs in Australia is trade dependent. So for us, free trade matters.
And the Prime Minister has come and he has said that there won't be retaliatory tariffs. There won't be use of the mechanism, the disputes mechanism used under the US-Australia Free Trade Agreement. Do you think that's the right way to go? Just kind of let things settle for a bit and go from there?
Unquestionably, in my view. I think that there are some different types of steps that we can take or continue taking now that we've got confirmation. And let's be clear here, it is useful now to know where we stand. There has been so much uncertainty for such a long period of time as to how tariffs would be applied, what they would look like, to whom they'd be applied, whether or not there was scope to secure an exemption. I've had so many different dealings and discussions with counterparts in Washington, with our contacts in Washington, certainly with Australian government officials in Canberra, and also, of course, with Kevin Rudd and his embassy team over in Washington as well. And that sense of uncertainty, of not being sure what the process is or what the results might be, has been frustrating at times. We now know what the position is. It's a 10% tariff. Fortunately, that position is a little bit lower, of course, than what many other countries have been slapped with today by the US administration. It is good that we're at the lower end, and it is good that we also, as I say, know what our position is. In terms of next steps, I think it's really important that we continue to focus on putting Australia's case, and we do have a strong case to put, both in terms of the reasons that have already been articulated, our trade deficit to the United States, our AUKUS support, our long and strong standing friendship. All of those things matter. But there are also so many different things that Australia can add to the table. Let's remember that we had a period of 8 months in 2017 before Australia was able to secure an exemption from tariffs. We should continue to negotiate methodically, calmly, consistently, making Australia's case, putting forward what is in our best interests. And I know that our officials and our government agencies and our leaders are very much engaged in that process, and I support them wholeheartedly.
There seems to be some wriggle room in some areas. So the beef exporters, our largest export to the US, hit with 10%. Not good, but it's not any more than that. There are definitely carve-outs, it seems, in the fact statement from the White House around pharmaceuticals, around bullion. Are they the sorts of things we should be discussing from the get-go, given that in black and white there is a suggestion that you can actually be exempt from tariffs?
Indeed, we should be looking at how we can go about securing the strongest type of exemptions that we can. I thought was very interesting in this morning's report, and I believe from memory it was 397 pages, but as you sift through it, the great majority of that lengthy document is devoted to running through the tariff position that will apply to each and every country in the world. So you can understand why a document is so long when you account for all the different countries that document needs to account for. What it doesn't say is the rationale for the calculation of various different tariffs. We've seen with the graphic that the Secretary for Commerce held up during the President's press conference that there was a base position of calculation being made as to the tariffs charged to the United States. Now, I'm just looking at it right now as I talk. And then, of course, there's a further column that speaks to the discounted reciprocal tariff that is proposed to be applied, or that indeed is being applied by the United States to different countries. It's very unclear when you go through that 397-page document as to how the tariffs charged to the United States have been calculated, and indeed the discounted rate that's been applied to different countries as well. What that means is that whilst, of course, this process might have the appearance of being very scientific, let's remember that there is always going to be, with this type of process, an element of arbitrariness to it. And what that necessarily means is that there's scope for us to play in the grey area. And we should continue to do that by putting forward our case as strongly as possible.
Is the biggest risk in what's happened in the last 24 hours a global economic downturn? Is that really the big issue for Australia?
Yes, of course it is. Absolutely. It is, of course, a concern to us that there is a 10% tariff that's been applied to our exports to the United States that may have the impact of reducing demand in the United States for the goods, services that we're producing. But let's remember here that the larger concern, the broader, bigger issue, is always going to be, what do all of these tariffs look like for the world, but also for Australia in terms of our engagement with the world? What does that do to demand for Australian products more broadly? For instance, if you've got a country like China, which has a 34% discounted reciprocal tariff that's just been applied as of today, what does that mean in terms of Chinese demand for Australian commodities, for instance? And in turn, what does that mean for Australian jobs and Australian businesses here at home? I ask those as questions because, unfortunately, we just don't know the answers to these points yet. There are so many variables, and they'll all come out in the wash over the course of the coming months.
Stay with me, Bran. We'll be back in a minute. I'm speaking to BCA Chief Executive Bran Black. Bran, we're in the midst of an election campaign. Currently, both the Prime Minister and opposition leader are standing firm against these tariffs. The US has suggested this is now the starting point for negotiations. How do you think this runs politically?
In the context of an election, is that the point that...
In the context of the election, yeah.
Look, I think what we've said consistently, and I would really emphasise this point, we want to see Australia respond to these tariffs by doing the things that are wholly within our control. You know, you look at the world at large at the moment, and it is a sea of uncertainty. There are so many different variables that are coming into play. We've, of course, got our energy transition. We've got the impact of artificial intelligence. There's still global conflicts at play. And then we've got tariffs as well. So when you overlay all of those things one on each other, it makes for a difficult and uncertain world. And in those circumstances, we can really just control what we can control. To my mind, that's making sure that we present as a country the most competitive investment proposition to the rest of the world, and indeed to domestic businesses as well. That means that we want to see politically in this election the focus very much on what Australia can do to set itself up to be competitive. That means getting our investment fundamentals right. What we can do with respect to tax reform. I know Fear and Greed loves talking about tax reform, so do we. What it means with respect to industrial relations, what it means with respect to our planning systems at a state level and at a federal level. And of course, what we can do to deregulate. There's a lot of what I would say is, in terms of what's coming from the Trump administration, points that we disagree with, certainly in terms of tariffs. But one thing that we should remember is that from a United States economic perspective, a big part of President Trump's agenda is making the American investment environment as attractive as possible. This is already the Western world's most competitive and productive economy. If we want to continue to be competitive, if we want to continue to secure global investment, then we need to get our skates on in deregulating, in reducing planning process timeframes, in making sure that our tax system's competitive and so on.
Do you think the coalition and the government ahead of the election are taking this seriously enough?
Well, there's no question that both sides of politics are responding seriously to the tariffs that have been imposed today.
So beyond the tariffs, though?
I do think it's really important that there be a much stronger focus from both sides on producing genuinely long-term economic plans. One of the things that frankly scares me is that we face into a demographic time bomb as things stand right now. Back in 1980, I think we had 6.5 people working in our economy for every one person who was retired over the age of 65. Now it's about 3.8, and by 2060, it's projected to drop to 2.7. So that means a very significant tax burden falling on the shoulders of proportionately fewer workers if we're to continue to provide the same quality of life that we're fortunate enough to experience today. These are major intergenerational problems that we need to address, and we can only do that by growing the size of the pie, if you will, by making our economy competitive. And that means we need to look beyond short-term policy solutions and instead start to really address the fundamentals that will set us up for success. And those are the things that I was talking about before.
Bran, thank you for talking to Fear and Greed.
It's always a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
That was Bran Black, Chief Executive of the Business Council of Australia. This is the Fear and Greed Business Interview. Join us every morning for the full episode of Fear and Greed, daily business news for people who make their own decisions. I'm Sean Aylmer. Enjoy your day.